Hello, and welcome to this event about the Citizens' Assembly on Democracy in the UK. I'm Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing the event. In recent years, the use of citizens' assemblies, representative groups of members of the public, to debate major policy issues has become more common around the world. In the UK, examples include the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, organised by the Constitution Unit in 2017, and Climate Assembly UK, organised on a much more official basis by 6 House of Commons select committees. There are various other examples. The Citizens' Assembly on Democracy in the UK was also organised by the Constitution Unit, along with the public participation charity Involve. It's one key part of our Democracy in the UK After Brexit project, which is exploring public attitudes to post-Brexit governance funded by the ESRC. Some of you will have seen news of our large-scale public opinion poll published in January, about which there was a previous event of this kind. And I hope that many of you will have already had a chance to look at the report from the Citizens' Assembly, published on the 7th of April. Details should be included in the chat, and it's also on our website. The Citizens' Assembly on Democracy met for 6 weekends in late 2021 to consider how people want UK democracy to work. Within that time, it couldn't look at everything, but it considered some of the most fundamental questions that have arisen in recent years, including those attracting attention during the Brexit process and those highlighted in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019 and subsequently. Centrally, those issues include the relationship between government, parliament, the courts, and the public, as well as democratic standards and how they're best regulated. The Assembly's report includes a wealth of analysis on these questions, with 8 broad agreed resolutions and 51 recommendations. So we're here today to hear more about the process of the Citizens' Assembly on Democracy, as well as its conclusions. We've got a terrific panel who I'm now going to introduce. Kayla Scott is Director of Innovation and Practice at Involve and was the design and facilitation lead for the Citizens' Assembly on Democracy in the UK. Professor Alan Rennick is my colleague at the Constitution Unit and the leader of the Democracy in the UK After Brexit project. They'll give a brief overview of the Citizens' Assembly, how it worked and what it discussed. We'll then hear from Paddy and Paul, 2 members of the Assembly, about what it was like taking part and their reflections on the process. And last, we'll hear reflections from 2 people who very kindly appeared as expert speakers at the Citizens' Assembly. Catherine Barnard, who's Professor of European Union and Labour Law at the University of Cambridge and a Senior Fellow at the UK and a Changing Europe, and Frances Foley, who's Deputy Director of the pressure group Compass. They're going to speak in that order, with the first 4 speakers having just 3 minutes each, and the 2 respondents up to 5 minutes each. Because time is so short, I'm going to give a sign to each of you as a warning when you've just got 1 minute left of your speaking time. Before we get to the speakers, we've got an excellent short video about the Assembly, which we're going to play you. After the video and hearing from the speakers, we'll move to a Q&A session. So please be ready with your questions. You can submit them at any time. If you've got a question, please write it in the Q&A area rather than the chat. And James Cleaver, who's here as our Q&A facilitator, will select from among the questions, and as standard, he'll invite you to ask your own question by unmuting yourself. If you prefer James to ask your question for you, that's fine. Just indicate when you submit it, and you can also submit questions anonymously. This whole event, including the Q&A, is being recorded, and we'll post it online afterwards on our website and YouTube channel, and it will become a Constitution Unit podcast. You may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to ask your own question. So that's more than enough preliminaries from me. Let's hand over to James, who's going to start the video.
Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long day if not.
The difficulty is how fragile democracy can be. You really need citizens to be engaged for the system to work.
Why do I think we don't have a voice? Money. When you've got money, you've got loads of voice.
The Brexit referendum has affected the way people think about politics currently in the UK.
Democracy is hugely important in our daily lives.
Democracy is something that changes all the time. It's been emerging and evolving in the UK over the centuries. If you think back all the way to Magna Carta, the Great Reform Act, women being enfranchised in the early 20th century, and it's continuing to change today. If you think of the referendum a few years ago on Brexit, that was a big change in our democracy. And it created actually quite a lot of tension about just how should our democracy work? What should the role of Parliament and government and the public and the courts be in our democratic process? And now's a really good time for us just to reflect on where do we want our democracy to be going in the future.
So Citizens' Assembly basically brings together a randomly selected group of people that are selected to be broadly representative of, in this case, the UK. And they come together to really learn about a topic, engage in dialogue with each other and with the experts, before then going through that deliberative process that asks them to come to some collective conclusions.
My postman dropped my letter through the door. I saw Citizen Assembly. And I'm saying, is this for real? Because you got people going around doing fraud. I said, is this for real? So I said, okay, I don't want to send my detail out there, but I'm going to take a chance.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. I actually looked forward to it. I was amazed at some people's views. Some of them I disagreed with, some of them I agreed with.
It took place over a number of weekends. Each weekend had its own theme, with a different panel of experts all providing evidence to the Assembly as a whole to digest. And then we would break out into our Zoom breakout groups and discuss all the things that we'd learned. And then there would be a number of sort of activities to help us formulate some initial ideas, which would then form into the ultimate recommendations.
We sort of initiated a set of rules ourselves to allow the open and honest dialogue without no abuse, etc., and freedom of speech and thought.
The whole principle was you can disagree, but we keep it polite, we keep it respectful, and that was really important, and I realised that's what is often missing in our political debate at the moment.
At the beginning, I tell them, I said, listen, I like when people use words that I understand, because I know you've got the well-educated people, but you have to remember the little people that's not so educated. So use words that we understand, and if you use words that we understand, we communicate better.
People's opinions on the committees were varied, and it was good to hear different opinions. And in actual fact, sometimes I actually changed my mind on some things. And I thought, that person has got a good point. That does work, that would work.
We tackled a lot of issues. One of the strongest feelings was behind freedom of speech and people being allowed to demonstrate. Because that is an aspect of British politics which has always been protected.
I felt particularly passionate about the recommendation about access to information because to be engaged in the process you have to understand it, you need to know how to contact your MP, you need to know how to participate. And my background as a librarian was very much about enabling people to get the information they need to be involved in whatever it is they want to be involved in.
My interest in politics in the UK was really sparked as a result of the Brexit referendum and everything that came off the back of that. So I was really interested to get people's views on the role of referenda going forward for the country as a whole, from a whole range of different perspectives that are different to mine.
The organisation of the Citizens' Assembly, they listen to the non-elites. If you have an organisation like that out there for people like me that will listen to me, yeah, then our voice will be heard.
A Citizens' Assembly should be assembled really every time there's a really important law to be passed and get the view of the public, not just the view of one party.
Last summer we started off the project by doing a really big survey of public opinion in the UK, and that showed two really big findings. First, people want politicians who are honest and act with integrity, and second, they don't want power to be too concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals at the top of the system. But through the Citizens' Assembly, we wanted to find out, well, how do they want to achieve these things? And the Assembly expressed that through 8 resolutions and then also 51 recommendations that give precise, detailed proposals as to how things should change.
Lying or intentionally misleading Parliament should be able to be identified as contempt of Parliament, as well as being made to give a public apology. MPs who break this rule should be fined or otherwise punished.
The use of referendums should be restricted to when there are clearly defined but contentious choices, where the consequences of the decision can be accurately set out in advance.
To allow for effective public participation in political debate and scrutiny, freedom of speech and the right to protest need to be protected.
Information on what is happening in Parliament and government should be freely available to all in a form that is concise, factual, accessible and unbiased. More work is needed so that people know where to look and can quickly find the information they want.
The deliberative process should be used to enhance local as well as national decision making, so that decisions are made that are informed by what local people want.
The members of the Citizens' Assembly worked incredibly hard to deliver this report, and they deserve now to be taken seriously. So we're working now to bring their proposals to policymakers in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. And my message to them is, listen to the members of the Citizens' Assembly. You don't have to agree with everything that they said, but listen to them and consider now what are your next steps.
Thank you very much, James. And I hope that was a useful introduction for everybody. You'll see that our first 4 speakers were already in the video, Kayla, Alan, Paddy and Paul. But we're now going to pass over to them in that order to tell us a little bit more. So Kayla, get us started.
Thanks. So as Meg said, I work for an organisation called Involve, and we were responsible for actually the sort of design and facilitation of what took place when we brought the members together for this assembly. So the 76 members, the members that actually saw us right through and developed up these recommendations with us, as was said in the video, broadly representative of the population of the UK and from right across the UK. And they were mixed in terms of both their sort of demographic characteristics, but also their political views and their level of political engagement and participation in activity. They came together for 6 weekends, which is a lot of time to spend, especially when it is online. So we spent a lot of time in Zoom rooms like this with all of the 76 members, various speakers, and also the facilitation team. And it was mentioned in the video that, you know, we mixed our time between presentations from speakers and working in small groups, small discussion groups with a facilitator there, where the members could really have those conversations with each other and start testing out how they responded to some of the things they were being told, but also their existing own opinions and their own experiences of living in the UK and participating in that democracy. One of the big challenges about taking an assembly like this online is that, you know, you really want to make sure there isn't that barrier to people to participate if they're not used to being on Zoom calls and doing these types of things, or actually just don't even have the equipment. So a big part of getting people ready to take part in this process involved this kind of support in the background to equip people both physically if they didn't have a laptop or something that was going to be useful, but also to be able to engage with the technology and not have that as a barrier to them being able to participate in the discussions. Really central to these deliberative processes like this is that there is that process of learning. And, you know, while in the discussions, the members came together showing that they had this intrinsic value for the sense of democracy and the idea of democracy. Most hadn't given a lot of real consideration as to what the specifics was that made a good democracy. So they heard from almost 30 speakers across the 6 weekends who were selected for their expertise, but also to give a real balance and range of opinions and perspectives to the members. And really importantly, they got to question their speakers, engage with them before they then worked together to develop up their recommendations. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kayla. And well within time. So very grateful to you. Let's pass over to Alan.
Thanks very much, Meg. So my task here is to give you a whirlwind tour of the Assembly's recommendations. You saw a few of them in the film, and you saw that there are lots of recommendations in total, which are nested under 8 broad resolutions. I can't possibly go through all of them, so I'll attempt to talk about 3 key themes that I think really come out from those recommendations. So the first is that members expect high ethical standards of honesty and selflessness from their elected representatives, and they support a stronger role for regulators in order to achieve this. And there was really overwhelming support for this. And I think it's interesting because commentators sometimes claim that people don't really care about standards. And the evidence that they tend to have for this, I think, is that scandals seem to have fairly limited impact on who people vote for. But the message from the Assembly, and indeed the other bits of our research that Meg talked about, is that that is wrong. If standards don't affect who people vote for terribly much, that's because most people think that all politicians are pretty much the same. So why would it affect which politicians they vote for? But people do care about this, and they do want the issue to be addressed. Second, members do not want power to be concentrated too far within the executive. There are important proposals within the report for parliamentary reforms, greater role for Parliament in deciding dates of recess, an ability of MPs to recall Parliament, a cross-party committee to allocate time for private members' bills, and various other things. I should say though that that members wanted to emphasise that where a government does have a majority and a manifesto commitment, then it should be able to get through those commitments, though with scrutiny. And within this same theme, members also advocated a strong role for the courts, including a power to overturn laws that violate legally protected human rights. And they certainly opposed any curtailment of the power of the courts. And then the third theme is that members wanted better mechanisms for the voice of the public to be heard. There's a series of recommendations on improving education on politics and the information that's available about politics. Paddy talked about one of those in the film. You saw the recommendation from Paul in the film on protecting free speech and right to protest. Members thought the role of petitions should be strengthened. They saw referendums as an important part of democracy, but also wanted them to be used sparingly, and again emphasized the need for high quality information. And finally, they wanted to see greater use of deliberative processes such as citizens' assemblies, though to advise policymakers not to make final decisions. So summing all of that up, there's a real program of thoughtful and considered reforms here, and one that I think now deserves detailed attention from policymakers throughout the UK.
Wonderful, thank you, Alan. And now we'll just pass over to the 2 members to give us some views from how it was from where you were sitting, and be brutally honest, maybe we didn't organise it well enough. How was it for you? Paddy, would you like to go first?
Yes, and thank you for having me along at this seminar. Brutally honest, no, it was good. I have to say, at a period of time where life was fairly boring because of COVID and one had been locked away for some time, it had certain novelty value. But when the email first appeared, I thought, oh, well, this is obviously a scam, but I checked it out and realised it wasn't, that this was genuine. I was really quite surprised to be one of the few people who actually ended up in the process, because that's a lot of odds not in favour of being involved. And it was a big time commitment for sure, but that was fine for me. I had time. The tech stuff was fine for me too. But what I gained from it, I guess that's the thing that's useful to know. I mean, from a personal point of view, I found it really informative. I already have a reasonable background knowledge of politics and government, but it kind of reminded me of things that I'd forgotten about, or just things that I didn't care about anymore. And it did sort of re-engage me in the whole idea of government and politics. So for me personally, that was a gain. And of course, we got all this information from the experts who knew what they were talking about. We got the opportunity to meet other people. That was the thing that was really interesting, because we're used to now either meeting with people we know and like, or going online and just blocking them or not listening to them anymore because it all gets so offensive and rude and unpleasant. So when I say forced, we weren't forced. I could have walked away any time, clearly. being engineered into a group of people where you were respectfully having to listen to their opinions and views was really valuable. And I was really taken aback by some of the opinions and views, which I kind of knew were out there, but I can't say I'd met it in person that I can recall. And what I would have liked from the whole process, which was clearly impossible, would be to be able to sit around a cup of coffee or in a bar and talk in a more relaxed, informal way about a lot of topics. If I were to just have one main thought about the whole process, no, actually there's a few, but I'm running out of time. The main thing is it didn't change my whole worldview on stuff. That is fairly untouched, but there were a lot of areas where I thought, oh yeah, we're doing that badly. We could do that better. That's and the phrase I think you used, how fragile it can be, was really brought home to me. And I thought this is why it's important. And if there's one outcome I'd like, is this to not end up in some dusty library shelf somewhere, or whatever the equivalent on cyber libraries are now. Do they get dusty there? I don't think so. But I'd like it to be heeded, because we're just normal people who have opinions, and I'm not sure how often normal people are listened to.
That is wonderful. Thank you, Paddy. That gives a really nice flavour. I wonder if it feels the same from where Paul was sitting. Would your reflections echo those, or do you have other things you draw attention to?
I do agree with a lot of what Paddy said. The reason I joined the Citizens Assembly was, one, I was invited to, which was nice, but basically Brexit, but not because of the usual Brexit in, out, right, wrong situation. Brexit alarmed me in how much it's divided people in the UK to in, out, right, wrong, with no middle ground and no place for debate. And it frightens me that we really could lose our democracy and the ability for consensus and common sense to prevail to political dirty tricks, really. Don't forget that an MP was murdered in the run-up to Brexit by a political fanatic, and one has been murdered since by a religious fanatic, which goes to show me just how dangerous a point we're at, really. But anyway, on to the actual assembly, I'm heartened. As much alarmed as I was about Brexit, I'm more heartened having taken part in the assembly, because the people on it were from various age groups, various parts of the country, various parts of the social structure of the country, and we all had slightly different, sometimes very different views. But I think we proved that we're more the same than we are different, because we could actually hold a debate, which I think was far better than some of the debates I've seen in Parliament, where both sides listened to each other, learned from each other, so actually took things on board and analysed perhaps ourselves as much as we analysed the people who were saying things that we didn't agree with in the beginning, but came to agree with. And I think our politicians can learn a lot from this sort of debate, a proper structured debate, not scoring points off each other, trying to learn from each other's experiences. And that's an important word, experience. And I think personally, I believe now that self-regulation is not working for MPs. And I think if you look at the percentages in favour of some of the recommendations we made, then people don't believe that self-regulation is working, and that MPs' behaviour needs to be brought into line in a firmer manner. But there we are. I really enjoyed the process. I thought it was well conducted, and particularly Kayla, if I may say, she held a lot of it together. So well done, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and well done, both of you and all of the members. And indeed, I completely agree with you about Kayla and her fantastic contribution. Let's pass to our two relative outsiders, although both Catherine and Francis not only came and gave evidence to the Assembly, which was terrific, and met some of the members and took part in those discussions. They're also both on the steering group for the project, so helped to guide some of our design. So I suppose they can't completely wash their hands of any mistakes that we made. Catherine was going to go first to give us her reflections on perhaps both the process and the outcomes, whatever you choose to comment upon.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you in particular to the Citizens Assembly members for their extremely articulate and thoughtful reflections. So I was one of the so-called experts in the Citizens Assembly, and my background is the law, and I was involved in the session on the role of the courts. But just before I say something about that, I just wanted to reflect on the Citizens Assembly process. I've had the privilege of being involved in 2 citizens' assemblies via the Constitution Unit. The first one was in person and the second one online. And clearly in person is more desirable, but in the circumstances, not at all possible on this occasion. But I thought actually the way that it had been set up this time with breakout groups and sessions with everyone together worked as well as it possibly could have done. And I think that's largely to do with the huge amount of work that had gone on in the background in preparation for the event. And there I take my hat off to Meg and to Alan and the team for the extraordinary amount of legwork. But I would also say that for the participants too, it's extremely onerous to have to listen to really quite significant amounts of information over a short period of time. And again, I take my hat off to all of those who actually participated in the programme and stuck with it. As you've heard, 6 weekends is quite a significant sacrifice of time. Now, the part I was involved in was on the role of the courts, and I was talking primarily with Richard Eakins, Professor of Law at Oxford, and he's a kind, well-known and very thoughtful man and a critic of what he sees as excess judicial engagement with what he sees as political matters. And inevitably, we ended up touching on the Miller decisions. Those were the 2 key big cases in and around Brexit brought by Gina Miller, challenging aspects of the behaviour of the executive. Now, my personal view is more favourably disposed towards the courts, but I am also very aware, and I think the judges are themselves, that they need to be sensitive to the limitations of the judicial role. And there is a paradox with the courts, it seems to me, because of course the judges are not democratically elected. The judges, particularly in the higher courts, are still predominantly white and male. And yet what's so striking about the Citizens' Assembly was that the overwhelming view was that the judges and the courts were overwhelmingly trusted. And I wonder whether that's because they feel the judges are not contaminated in a way that politicians are, despite all of the attempts by certain newspapers, as you saw in the video, to try to smear some of the judges by describing them as enemies of the people. And I wonder whether the trust in the courts is in part a response to what we saw as the first resolution, the first principle that Citizens Assembly came up with, which Alan mentioned in the film, namely the overwhelming desire by 98% of the participants to have honesty in politics. And if you remember, the principle says that the public should be able to trust their elected representatives and have confidence and faith in them and the democratic system. And what it seems to me is that because there was so much support for a role of the courts as a constitutional backstop, is in part a response to the fact that the participants, the delegates to the Assembly, felt that they were not able to trust politicians at the moment, but they could trust the judges. And their faith in the judges was really quite touching. Indeed, some of the resolutions indicated that the judges should do more than they do at the moment. For example, judges should be able to overturn laws which don't respect fundamental rights, whereas at the moment all they can do is, if the laws are an act of parliament, they can only make a declaration of incompatibility. So in conclusion, I would say the process for this Citizens' Assembly was extremely impressive. The participants even more impressive. And from my point of view, they reached the overwhelmingly right decision that we absolutely need to have a robust system of courts in our democratic system as a counterweight to a very strong executive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And then finally, I'm going to turn to Francis, but before I do so, let me just remind the audience to think about putting some questions in for the Q&A session. We've got a few coming in, but I know you don't want to discount what Francis has got to say, but if there's anything forming in your mind, submit it now, and do quickly submit it after Francis has spoken otherwise. So over to Francis.
Hi, and thanks very much for having me. And also, it's just great to hear all of this. I remember the first session we had with the advisory group not long ago, it feels like. And between now and then, all of this amazing work that's gone in. So a massive congratulations to the team, to everybody involved, and to the participants, as everyone has said. I thoroughly enjoyed being part of a speaker, being able to see it and being part of the process on the day. I was going to talk really briefly about my session, which was the role of the public. But before I do, I wanted to say that I found the process also incredibly interesting in the way that it balanced two elements. So on the one side, it was a sort of meta task of this Citizen Assembly to be focused on democracy, as it was also an innovation in democracy in itself. So you were both at the same time dealing with democracy questions and helping make and shape democracy and democratic norms. And I think that's something that maybe runs through all of my comments today and the way that I perceive this process as being so important. And the two things it balances, on the one hand, it's experimental. And so, this hasn't been done many times before. And I think also, especially the way it was run, as a lot of people have mentioned, the kind of huge efforts that went into facilitating access to this, including somebody going to somebody's house and popping up to help them, support them on their laptop, literally traveling to someone's home to make accessibility for them. Making it accessible for them. And I think that was incredibly impressive and heartening to see the lengths people will go to also allow people to participate in processes like this. And on the other hand, it was extremely professionally run and it was extremely well facilitated. And so I think having that kind of sense of allowing citizens to make of the process what they will, and enough space within the assembly process to allow them to take ownership over it, as well as having the architecture around it and making sure that things like this report are coming out and are being seen by people. I think both sides are extremely important in that, and has been incredibly impressive. So just a couple of reflections on the report vis-a-vis the role of the public. So to me, there were sort of three interesting pillars that came out. So the first was the role about the responsibility of citizens. And I think that what really captured my attention and imagination was this way that the assembly participants balanced the responsibility of citizens in a democracy, which goes back to that point about democracy is made by and upheld by citizens rather than politicians, and also the incumbent duties on politicians and actually the whole infrastructure of democracy to provide citizens and to open up access. So on the one hand, you said that, you saw in the report that it said the UK public has to be more engaged. There was a big emphasis on self-education and citizens stepping into their role as politicians. But on the other hand, and these were accompanying kind of rights as well as responsibilities, was this question that citizens also need to believe this is going to make a difference. And they need to believe that the politicians are going to listen to what they say. It needs to be meaningful. And the education systems need to be better at informing citizens from the beginning and helping young people to think that politics is not a dirty word. That was one of my favourite quotes in the report. Secondly, then there was this big bucket of things which I felt like were age-old things about democracy, and it was kind of encouraging to see them come up again. So things like strong independent media, freedom of speech and right to protest, the idea of scrutiny and transparency and accountability with strong themes, as Alan's already mentioned. But then I also felt that there was also new things that came up, which maybe reflect the times that we're living in. So some of those things would be What Paul was also mentioning there about the division caused by Brexit, this idea of maybe losers' consent of being able to accept the decisions that you also don't agree with, but finding ways to move forward as a citizenry. And questions around also deliberation as coming up as deliberation having a role within our parliament and within our public and being part of that process. So I think for me, what really this whole session kind of raised, and it was so fascinating to kind of speak and then hear what the Assembly members came back with, was this idea that people and citizens are not just sort of supplicants to politicians, they're also participants and they help shape democracy in that way. And that participation has to feel meaningful. So to me, what this kind of led me to think is this needs to go beyond the ballot box. We think to be more imaginative, and citizens are ready to be more imaginative and participative beyond just also elections. That democracy is not this static state, but is a practice, and it's an activity and an experience. And I think to just pick up the final point that Paul made there about experience, that citizens believe that they have life experience and skills and capacity that democracy needs to understand and make use of and hear. And when that happens, democracy can feel like it's flourishing outside of Parliament and outside of Westminster. So thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Francis. I can see that there are questions coming in. We'll pass to James in a moment. I might just start with a couple of questions for the panel, partly to pick up and ask our kind of experts who began, Alan and Kayla, who were facilitating the process, a couple of things, one of which comes very strongly, I think, out of what the members said. So one question which I think would be a natural one for Alan would be just to say a little bit about why this combination of opinion polls and a citizens' assembly and what the difference is in hearing public opinion from a poll versus from an assembly. And perhaps, you know, in this particular case, I think that's an interesting aspect of the project as a whole because it combines the two. But then it came out really nicely, I think, from both what Paddy said and what Paul said, how a citizens' assembly, at least with the people in the room, can combat polarization, can actually get people listening to each other across various divides. And I just wonder whether you think, maybe particularly Kayla, but Alan would have thoughts on this as well, I think, whether there's an opportunity here for politicians to use citizens' assemblies more to combat polarization, because we have become very polarized, particularly famously over Brexit, but also how you can spread that out beyond the people who are lucky enough to find themselves in the room, how we can use that to sort of convince people at large to be less polarized by using these kinds of mechanisms. Alan, would you like to go first?
Both questions are great. I'll resist the temptation to go on the second one because Kayla will have lots of good things to say about that. So just on the first one. So yes, polls give you the chance to find out what people respond immediately in the moment in answering a question. They typically do not spend any time thinking about it. So, you know, most polls these are done online. People go through the questions incredibly quickly. So you get a top of the head response to a question. A citizens' assembly gives you the chance to find out what people think when they've had a chance really properly to think about it, to hear from experts, to hear from other members of the public. And as both Paul and Paddy emphasized, that's often what's most important for members of a citizens' assembly. I think it's easy for me as a person who's slaved for months finding suitable experts to speak to the assembly members, to focus in on the expert learning program, as it were. And members learn from that, but they learn from each other and from speaking with people with very, very different experiences of life. And they have a chance to deliberate and think. And then they come up with answers to the question. So you get very, very different sorts of information from polls and from a citizens' assembly. So democracy clearly ought to be, outcomes ought to be molded in significant part by what the public think. Ideally, I would say the democratic ideal is that outcomes are shaped by what people think once they've had a chance to ponder and explore and investigate options. In practice, politicians are often going to be shaped by what will affect their re-election prospects. So you need both of those kinds of information. Information about what people think on the top of their heads when they first encounter an issue, and information when people have explored matters in depth and are project is intended, therefore, to provide both kinds of information. So the survey gives us a very broad sense of what the public think. The Citizens' Assembly allows us to go deeper. And I guess one of the interesting things about the outcomes is that there's almost no disagreement between what the Citizens' Assembly said and what the public said. So there's sometimes a suspicion that somehow if you expose people to lots of experts and people like me and Meg and academics and so on, then you'll kind of push them in a particular direction in their opinions. That did not happen at all here. The results are very, very similar. What you do get from the Citizens' Assembly is a lot more depth and a lot more detail, and you get recommendations on all sorts of specifics that you just can't get from a survey because people haven't thought about, and they don't know about many of the issues in that kind of detail.
Terrific, thank you. And yes, it's very striking, isn't it, when you look at the poll. In a sense, maybe the poll was also quite pleasing in terms of giving you faith in people and democracy, because we were expecting those results to be quite polarized, given that we know we're living in a polarized world with sort of Brexit, choice driving whether people thought the courts should be more powerful or Parliament should be more powerful or the Prime Minister should be more constrained or whatever. We didn't see that really very much in the poll either, did we? So maybe that makes us think that while we feel polarized, we're less polarized than we fear when we actually sit down and think about things. Kayla, come in on the point that I raised, and then I'm going to go straight to James because I can see there are lots and lots of questions from the audience.
I'll try and keep it quite brief, but I think that the whole fundamental thing with these sort of deliberative processes like citizen assemblies is they rely on building a dialogue between people. And actually it was picked up by sort of in the video and by Patty, I think there earlier, really people who come from different backgrounds, different experiences, have different perspectives, and very often because of the way we live our lives, don't actually interact or have those opportunities to engage and discuss important things. And whether it's about democracy or other important factors of life, it's building that culture of a kind of shared inquiry where everyone has to step back and do that reflective thing of, well, hang on, why do I have that first response? Why do I have that immediate, opinion? And take it to the process that then starts, weighing up and balancing and building on sort of what are the real values behind these types of decisions that we're looking at making. And I think what was really important is that while the Assembly talked about wanting, things like assemblies and other processes like this to be used more in decision making, used more by government, used more to inform some of the decisions that are being made, it was very much still resting on the fact that actually they wanted the representative system to work. They wanted to be fairly and effectively for the public to be represented by the people elected, and therefore coming forward with this idea that actually for the way that decision makers and politicians should be informed is through listening to things like assemblies, like those processes where people have really explored what their position is on different aspects of some of the big problems or big questions in society.
Thank you very much. I realised listening to the two experts speak that we've got the role of the courts, the role of the public. There's nobody here except maybe me to speak up for the role of Parliament. And I think the conclusions there are really interesting, aren't they? Because the members decided, and I think there's a lot of sense in these decisions, they want Parliament to be more powerful, but they also want it to be better. So there's some circles to square there, or whatever, the other way around. James, you've taken a look through the questions. There are lots of them. Who do you think we should call?
Thanks, Meg. So I'm going to start with 3 questions about process. So there's lots of questions about the recruitment process for this. And Stephen Gosling has a question on recruitment. Then Tom Schiller has a question on the resources required for running a citizens' assembly. And finally, Grant Paisley has a question about the technical support provided for members.
Okay, and this is a particularly good opportunity for Kayla to come in because she's going to have to leave a bit early. So Stephen, I can see that you've unmuted. Ask your question.
Hi, Steve Gosling. Full disclosure, I'm approaching this from a sort of a Lib Dem and a Unlocked Democracy perspective, being involved in those two organisations. So just a bit of clarity there. And I think I've got to say, I think this is such an impressive piece of work. you should all be applauded, especially the people actually on the Assembly, for putting in such a sterling amount of effort. But I guess this really is for Kayla. Can you give us a list of the various different characteristics that you identified as needing a real range among the people that you sought for the Assembly? Because there's so many different ways to break society down, to slice and dice.
Yeah.
Can we take the three together? So I had Tom was mentioned next, but I don't see Tom on the screen. So maybe we go straight to Grant, and then Tom, if you could unmute.
Hi, thanks very much, Meg, and for the opportunity. It's a very simple, practical question I have, which is about trying to understand how we can support people to take part in these types of assemblies online. You know, when we have all sorts of barriers, from technical barriers related to how well somebody's broadband is, to knowledge of how to use the software and hardware, and other barriers that might be related to the abilities of people to be able to see, hear, move, etc.
That's a great question, and one or other or both of the members might want to come in on that based on their experience or what they've learned from other people around the table with them. Tom.
Thanks. I don't need any persuasion of the value and merits of citizens' assemblies, but I am concerned about the barriers. So I just wanted to ask, to make a decent quality citizens' assembly, what are the resources that are actually needed for that? And I accept that might vary depending on the topic, but can we have any idea of the range of costs involved?
Okay, great. Now we've got a very big panel, and I don't want to just go around the whole panel on every question because everything will take a long time. We'll get repetition. If you want to come in on something, can I encourage you to signal? Otherwise I'll choose. And obviously we're going to come to Kayla. Would Paul or Paddy like to comment on the question about what support people need in your experience of this assembly? Oh, great, both of you. Paul.
Yes, there is an issue. Obviously, I'm slightly computer literate and have access to the funds for the internet. But, I mean, maybe the Citizens' Assembly process could exist as an entity, and the computer, you know, people could be, maybe the town halls could be used, or schools, and people could be taken to there in order that they can participate if they want to. So maybe not from our homes, but maybe there are places around any community, libraries, that we could use as a hub.
That's great. I think there was at least one member who was regularly traveling elsewhere because she didn't actually have connection at home. So yes, community facilities is an interesting thought. Paddy, you wanted to come in as well?
Yes, mainly to say, for some of us, it really wasn't an issue at all. And sitting at home with a laptop was just, lovely. I mean, but I could see very easily in how often it did produce problems for some people. And it did kind of occupy me to a certain extent, thinking, can we really make this truly representative in some way if it's so hard for some people to be involved? If you know the practical level of how can you spare X amount of hours a day sitting at a computer when you've got other responsibilities. But it was okay for me, is all I can say, really. And I think Paul's idea about some kind of community facility sounds like an excellent one. Yeah.
Kayla, I think there are some real representational trade-offs between in-person and online, aren't there, which you might want to roll up with your comments about what traits we're looking for in members, etc.
No, thanks for those comments, Paddy and Paul. Just in terms of the broadly representative of the UK population, the criteria that was used in this, we worked with an organisation called the Sortition Foundation who actually did the recruitment. And there's, you're right, there's always that choice of what criteria do you use, what traits do you pick. The ones for this particular group were matched against sort of UK-wide figures in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, disability, level of formal education, regional spread across the UK, how people voted in the 2016 European Union referendum, how they voted in the 2019 general election, and their views on the role of citizens in democracy. So really tried to use quite a range there. It is challenging, and a lot of support was offered to people for the people who needed it. A lot of support was put in place in the background to try and reduce as many barriers as we could to people being able to participate. people who had identified from that initial, wide call of 20,000 invitations that went out, people who were then and put their expression of interest forward, were encouraged very much not to let the fact that they may not be familiar with using Zoom or other things, have an impact on them choosing to put their expression of interest forward. In the lead up to the assembly, people who didn't have, for example, a laptop or didn't have stable broadband connections, didn't have something with a camera, suitable headsets, whatever was needed to be able to participate, were all contacted individually. And where possible, that support was put in place, including providing data packages for people, providing laptops for people on loan when needed, dongles, all sorts of things for connectivity. Additionally, support was put in place and offered to people in terms of if they had childcare or other caring responsibilities, that things could be covered. And for a couple of the members who did express that they had either sort of visual or hearing impairments, we used things like the subtitling on all the videos, on all the speakers, things like this as well. So a lot of work did go in the background to make it as inclusive as possible. But you are right, there are some people that it won't necessarily work for.
That might roll very nicely into Tom's tricky question about how costly these things are. I don't know whether you want to comment on that or Alan wants to, because that's a lot of support.
It is, but I think, well, the organisation I work for particularly, we think that it is important that people who normally aren't able to participate in these things have that opportunity. So we do as much as we can, but you're right, it does cost. It's really difficult to put a sort of figure on how much an assembly or process costs, because actually so much comes down to the size, whether it's in person, whether it's online, whether it's one weekend, 2 weekends, 6 weekends in this case. And the other thing I should have said in terms of support, one of the other barriers that we try and remove, is that people who participate in the assembly also get paid an honorarium that recognises their time and commitment as well. And that also makes it something that people who, the opportunity cost of giving up that much time for some people without that sort of honorarium or gift of thanks can be another barrier that we try and remove.
Terrific, thank you very much. Does anyone else want to come in, or shall we go back to the audience? I'm not seeing indications. I should probably mention that the report of the Assembly, which includes all the recommendations and so on, also contains quite a detailed rundown of the process, including a breakdown of the demographics of the people and all of those factors that Kayla mentioned. So if you want to look it up further, do take a look at the report. Let's go back to James.
Great, thanks. So next up, I'm going to ask a pair of questions about content of the Assembly. One of them is from Joe Susek on the scope of the Assembly, and the other one is from Hugh Pope about one of the conclusions the Assembly came to regarding citizens' assemblies.
Joe?
Hi there. Thank you for the presentation. That's really interesting. I'm Joe Susek from Labour for a New Democracy. My question is, the report suggests that some Assembly members found it a bit frustrating that some of the elements of our democracy were deemed to be out of scope. And I think one of them was the electoral system, and I think that was the most cited one among those. And it seems to me that a number of the report's recommendations, such as Resolution 2A, can't really be addressed without considering electoral reform. And Resolution 2A is the one that basically talks about people needing to be more engaged with democracy, but noting that they won't unless they feel that they are going to make a difference. So I'd be really interested to know how the scope of the Assembly was set and whether the panel really feels that it was sufficiently broad or flexible. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hugh.
Thanks very much. Thanks for great presentations. It's a really inspiring project. My question follows on from Joe. If, as you say, everyone was so convinced of the quality of the debate and the effectiveness of the citizens' assemblies, as Paddy and Paul clearly make it out, and you've experienced, how is it, Alan, that people didn't want to make citizens' assemblies a bit bigger than they are today? Obviously, everyone has to get used to them. It may take years or decades, but why shouldn't they one day have an executive function? Is there some reason that we've blocked that road?
Interesting question. Both of those would quite naturally go to Alan, but if anybody else wants to come in, do indicate. Perhaps one of the members of the advisory committee would like to say something about scope, because this was something that we discussed quite a lot, how broad we could go and how much we could fit in. Alan.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. So Joe's question about the scope and how it was set. So we wanted to do a citizens' assembly whose report would not just sit on a dusty shelf, as Paddy said. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that the recommendations were on issues that policymakers are thinking about and are making decisions about. So as Meg said right at the start, we were building on the debates that had arisen through the Brexit process. There were lots of tensions that were shown about the proper roles of Parliament, government, the courts, and the public in the democratic system. So that was mainly where we focused. And we also saw that there was clearly a big need to look at issues of standards in public life. That was also a major issue. We couldn't possibly cover everything. We were already stretching what it's possible to cover and properly deliberate about within 6 weekends in choosing to cover the range of issues that we did. So electoral reform, I mean, Joe, you're obviously right that it's a big and important issue, but no one's going to make a decision about it in the next little while. It's not one of the issues that are currently on the agenda, and therefore that's the kind of difficult choice that we had to make. On Hugh's question, so the members were very keen that citizens' assemblies should play a bigger role and should be used, for example, if there's a major new policy that's brought forward, particularly one that hasn't been in the manifesto of the governing party, then they felt that there should be a citizens' assembly, and they recommended various circumstances in which assemblies should be held. But members also placed a strong emphasis on decision makers being accountable to the electorate. And so the recommendation saying that citizens' assemblies should be advisory, not having executive power, explicitly said that that is the case because citizens' assembly members are not elected, and therefore they're not accountable to the electorate. And that actually fits very strongly with what we got from the survey as well. You know, I said at the start that the results matched very closely. And when we asked people about different components of democracy and what were most important, the one that came top was that those in power are accountable to the wider electorate, and the wider electorate can remove those in power if they don't like what they're doing. So that focus on accountability, I think, was very important.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I can see Catherine's got her hand up. Again, with absolutely no obligation, I'd just like to say if either of the members would like to come in and speak from their point of view about whether to what extent it was frustrating being limited to not speaking about certain issues, because the electoral system did come up. It was a thing that some people wanted to talk about, but I think probably we all appreciated that we can't do everything. That's a challenge in a democratic assembly where you want to give ownership to the members, but you also need to keep it manageable. So if you have any thoughts on that, do chip in. But Catherine, you go first.
Thank you. Yes, I want to say clearly that pragmatism has a significant role to play in just trying to work out what is manageable. And there was, of course, there was quite a lot of time needed to be spent just explaining some really quite fundamental issues to our democracy, which are sometimes not clearly articulated, in particular the distinction between, for example, the Parliament, the executive and the courts, and particularly in respect of when the word government is used, trying to disaggregate whether government meant executive or Parliament or both. So there was quite a lot of time had to be spent dealing with that, those sorts of very fundamental, very important issues. But it did mean that the time got eaten up for doing other discussions. And in the area I was working in, of course, the courts and public law are directly relevant to this question of democracy, but courts do so much more than public law issues. And I think the citizens who participated absolutely saw that, but it did mean that the presentations were somewhat skewed because it focused on public law only, of necessity. And so, of course, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And it was certainly a whole lot better than doing nothing at all. But as academics, we're always desperate to show off all of our knowledge rather than just some of it. And being selective is always a difficult issue. And I think compromises had to be made, and that was inevitable.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in here before we go to the next round? Paddy or Paul, or indeed Francis, or Kayla? But Kayla, I think, is about to go. Okay, let's go back to James.
So a lot of people have asked about the future steps for the Assembly's recommendations and the project, and there's sort of three overlapping questions, one from Christine Eboral, one from Mark Scott, and one from Jan Usher on this topic.
Christine.
Hi, yes, thank you. It deserves a lot of attention, I can see. So my question really is, how are you planning to engage all four UK administrations in the recommendations? Do you expect some of them to be more receptive than others? I'm thinking particularly about Northern Ireland and the current state of affairs there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I can see Mark.
Yes, hello. My question is, can we actually expect the current crop of politicians to pay any attention at all to the results of initiatives like this Citizens' Assembly? It seems to me that for them to do that, they would have to admit certain failings on their part. And I don't see any evidence that they would be at all enthusiastic about that.
And then the last questioner was Jan. Not seeing Jan up on the screen yet.
I can read out Jan's question.
Sure, go ahead, James.
It's how much influence can the Assembly have on our political system? The latter is obviously very broken, and we need to instill trust again in our political systems using more types of citizens' assemblies.
Okay, so three very closely related questions there. I know Alan's going to have things to say on this, and I'm sure Kayla would if she wasn't leaving. I'd like to bring Francis in, I think, because I'm sure, Francis, you have thoughts on all of this, and you haven't been contributed to the questions yet. And then if either of the members would like to come in, you're very free to do so. And then I'll come to Alan, and indeed Catherine, if she wants to come in as well. So Francis.
Sure. So I think we're getting to the heart of it here, really, which is how to move people to listen to this amazing, amazing project, amazing initiative, and how do the questions, the proposals sort of get lifted up from the questions. So I think there's two ways to think about this. One is that there's a question about the interaction between competing systems. So I think there's a question about how our current system, which is very much based around the idea of representation, interacts with deliberation. I would say I think the two are complementary, but there are sort of competing, there are questions there about how the two weave together. So I go back to also how, if you ask a lot of people just, to do a word cloud about democracy, a lot of people would say voting in elections. Just calling back on my earlier comments, I think we need to move to a system where deliberation is seen as a fundamental part of a healthy democracy, and it allows citizens a way in. But of course, at the moment, we have a predominantly representative system. And of course, also we've seen sort of challenges to that through things like referendums, and has caused a lot of division. So obviously, I think politicians are probably unhealthily a bit defensive at the moment about their sort of authority and legitimacy. But the way that we often sell citizens' assemblies to politicians is to say, actually, the two are deeply complementary. And one of the things I like to say is, if you think about issues that politicians are really struggling over, or just really hard, complex, difficult problems, those are the sort of things that should go to a citizens' assembly, not least because it gives perspective, citizens get to state a view, but also because it helps politicians think this stuff through. So the way that we often approach politicians is to say, give us your hardest problem, we'll take it away, and citizens will give a lot of time and thought to it, something which is not often possible in a parliamentary cycle, and we'll come back and give you some recommendations which you can take away and think about. I think a lot more work needs to be done at shoring up politicians' role within this process, otherwise they're likely to be defensive and brittle about this. But the other thing I would say is we also need to, flip that understanding that democracy just happens within Parliament and Westminster. And I think these sorts of projects and the Citizens' Assembly on democracy post Brexit has also shown that this is part of a healthy democracy for people to be having those conversations. I think there needs to be a route into power, but I also think this conversation that needs to be sort of more widely understood is citizens need to understand what citizen assemblies are, and we want to normalize that culturally so that when people receive an invitation like Paddy, they think, oh, it's not, they know it's not scam, and they know it's something that people can participate in and actually get involved in. So the final point to make is there are politicians who are really supportive of citizen assemblies. They're not all the same. Lots of politicians really care about this and want to see more of them, both at a local and a national level. If you also go to Evolve's amazing tracker about local citizen assemblies, you can see the vast numbers of citizen assemblies that have taken place at a local level. I think we need to do more to promote and advertise those, basically, but they are happening, so let's not lose heart.
That's terrific, thank you. I don't know if either of the members want to come in. Otherwise, I might Yes, you would like to. That's great. I was going to say maybe at the end, if there's one thing you'd like to say to politicians about why they should listen to you or what you want them to listen to, what would it be? But you might want to throw that in with your comments now. Paddy.
Well, Francis just reminded me of something that really crossed my mind fairly early on in the process. I don't know how politicians or the people who come up with legislation actually really look at what they're deciding to do and how they come up with proposals. But it crossed my mind that this really would be a good way for politicians to actually, as Francis said, throw an idea to a bunch of people who represent a really wide range of society. You're not going to get everybody, clearly, it's not going to work that doing that. But at least it means you're going to stand less chance of throwing up nasty surprises when a decision is made and they go, we never thought of that might be the consequence, because I'm assuming civil servants have their say in all this too. But this just strikes me a good way of just bringing out all the warts and all, as well as the virtues of any proposals or any ideas for legislation. So yeah, that's where I think it has some value as well.
Thank you very much. So there are good sort of self-interested reasons why politicians might want to listen, because it will make, I mean, this is what we say about scrutiny in Parliament, and I think we probably said it at the Assembly, that having a diverse number of people look at your proposals avoids you making mistakes, rather than you making them in a closed room and then sort of announcing them to the public before anybody's had a chance to go through them and ask awkward questions. Paul, do you want to add anything? Otherwise, I'll offer Catherine the chance to come in and then Alan. No? Catherine, do you have any reflections on this? Because I think we're at the end now, and otherwise Alan's going to get the closing word.
I want to say clearly this is a very good thing. It's an expensive, demanding, time-consuming thing. And I think everyone involved thinks it's worthwhile. The big question is translation, how to get this out there. Clearly, Meg and her team are doing fantastic things, trying to promote it on social media and other places. But the buy-in from, actually probably too late for this generation of politicians, but for the next generation of politicians coming through, I think is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. And Alan. Alan has lots of thoughts on these questions.
Oh dear, that's bad. Can I first of all just endorse Frances Foley has just plugged her own report in the chat, and I strongly endorse her. It's a great read, so well worth looking at that. Yeah, so can I agree with what Paddy said? So Mark asked, can we expect current politicians to pay attention, and suggested that perhaps accepting the recommendations would be an admission of failing on their part. I don't think it would be an admission of failing on their part, and I think it's actually very important to see citizens' assemblies as not a threat to politicians. So firstly, just in terms of the process here, clearly politicians are always seeking guidance and advice from a whole range of experts and people with experience and all sorts of different things. Taking advice from a citizens' assembly is no different from that. You know, admitting that you got an idea from citizens ought not to be a shameful thing to do, and you know, it's a perfectly good thing to do. But I guess more broadly, I mean, it's sometimes suggested that citizens' assemblies are an alternative to Parliament and politicians. And politicians sometimes say they don't like citizens' assemblies because we've already got a citizens' assembly and it's called Parliament. That is really a wrong way of thinking about this, in my view. They're complementary roles. Politicians have an incredibly important role. We cannot have a democracy unless we have politicians. But they're also constrained by the role that they necessarily have. In particular, if you're an elected representative, if you've been elected on a manifesto with a commitments to do certain things, then you're limited in the degree to which you can subsequently deliberate and remain open-minded and say, oh, actually, I've changed my mind, because you're committed. You've been voted on the basis that you're going to implement a certain manifesto. So there are limits to the degree to which it's possible for politicians to deliberate in the kind of open-minded way that citizens in a citizens' assembly are able to do. So a citizens' assembly is offering a different approach to thinking about policy and developing policy in a way that I think is incredibly valuable, and adds to what politicians can do, complements what politicians can do, and helps politicians do a better job. So I hope they will listen. in response to Christine's question on what we're actually doing in order to encourage them to listen. So we have already sent copies of the report to all MPs, all MSPs, MLAs, MSs, and lots of other people as well. And we've engaged with quite a few of those people in various different ways. Just at the moment, we're doing an exercise to think through what are the next steps that would need to be taken in order to advance the recommendations. So Meg mentioned earlier, for example, various recommendations on parliamentary reform. Who needs to take that further, these further to the next step? So we're thinking about whom do we need to engage in specific dialogue with in order to advance these proposals. Christine asked if there's variation in interest across the 4 administrations. Maybe to some extent, but there's a whole different range of recommendations on different things. So I hope there will be things that interest people in and outside government at each level. Which finally leads me to Jan's question: how much influence can the Citizens' Assembly have? Don't know, but we'll be trying very hard to give it as much influence as possible. Given that this was a Citizens' Assembly that wasn't officially created by a parliament or a government, clearly there's a jump, there's a leap to be made in order to engage people. So it's a bit harder, but we will be doing our best. And I think there is real appetite for this among many politicians and officials. The conversations that I've had so far suggest that people are interested, they want to hear, and there will be action on at least some of these points from at least some people in positions of influence.
Thank you so much, Alan. We've come to the end, and I would just like to thank everybody for coming along to this event and for all of the fantastic audience questions. I'm sorry, as ever, we couldn't get to all of them. I'd like to thank the panel for their contributions, and again to thank everybody for the huge amount of work that went into the Citizens' Assembly. To Kayla, who's now gone, but others on her team are involved, all the expert speakers such as Catherine and Francis, and most importantly, Paddy, Paul, and all of the other Assembly members for the time and thought that they put into the exercise. I think you've done something really valuable, and I do hope that lots of people are going to want to read the report, including politicians, and that you in the audience and listening to this as a podcast and so on will go and have a look at it on our website and point others towards it to read. You can also point others to the recording on our podcast and on YouTube. We'll be alerting members of the audience when it becomes available. And finally, just let me plug our next event. In just 3 days' time, it will be the 25th anniversary of the election of the 1997 Labour government. Labour came to power with an ambitious programme of constitutional reform. And on the 17th of May, we've got a great panel reflecting on those reforms and their legacy. The panelists are Charlie Faulkner, who was, among other things, former Labour Lord Chancellor, Shami Chakrabarti, who's a Labour member of the House of Lords and former director of Liberty, and the unit's own Robert Hazel. So if you haven't already registered for that, please have a look on our website and do so for the 17th of May. But thank you all so much again for your participation and your attention, and we hope to see you at another of our events very soon.